If you open up a building next to a Dan Gilbert development, that's a good thing. There's more people on the sidewalk, more crowd, more buzz, more Instagram pictures. If you open up a development next to a village development, that's considered a bad thing because you're leaking customers away from the concessions, from the theater, from the stadium, et cetera, et cetera.
Today, a long-form conversation with author Conrad Kickert. He's a retail and planning expert and professor at the University of Cincinnati. His most recent book caught my eye, Dream City, Creation, Destruction, and Reinvention in Downtown Detroit. Backed up by research and global experience, he busts some myths about downtown Detroit and its history. He adds perspective from his career from world-class cities and working on making urban design and retail plans that actually work. He's very frank about the possibilities for the future for the city, that there is opportunity, but doing things as we did before isn't a path forward. I'm Jer Stays, and this is your Daily Detroit for Friday, January 24th, 2020. We'll get started with this conversation with Conrad Kickert right after we thank our members on Patreon that help make the show possible. This episode is ad-free thanks to you. Thanks to Tony, Allison, multiple Daves, Lon, Zach, Kathy, and many more. Consider joining these awesome people at patreon.com/Daily Detroit. Conrad, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Thanks for having me.
Detroit is kind of a niche topic for a lot of people, although it's gained a lot of national cachet lately. What got you interested just in the topic of Detroit before we get into everything else?
So originally I'm Dutch, and I come from a country where even the most mediocre history, even the most mediocre buildings are carefully preserved. And I went to Detroit for the first time in 2003. And I'm sure you remember 2003 downtown Detroit wasn't exactly the most vibrant place in the world, right? So I walked around and I rode around the People Mover, and I thought, what on earth is going on here? It was just fascinating. All these giant buildings, gorgeous, gorgeous buildings. You could clearly see that, completely vacant. And I thought to myself, I have to look into this. I have to see what's going on. What kind of city could let these beautiful buildings go to waste? And then, of course, while writing the book, finishing some basic research in 2011, but then while writing the book in the years to follow, all of a sudden, all those buildings came back to life. And I thought, how on earth could this happen so quickly as well? And so that really got me fascinated, is how do things fall so deep and then go back and come back in such a vibrant, if anything, overly vibrant way. So that's really what got me attracted to downtown Detroit, just a personal fascination.
As somebody who was in downtown in those times, it struck me how fast things turned around. When I worked for a place called the Detroit Regional News Hub a few years ago, it was something where you could see kind of the shoots of these kind of things happening, but I don't think anyone expected $1,500 one bedroom or studio lofts in the span of like 2 years. It feels like it just snapped in such a quick way that's almost like head spinning.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is, if anything, that just shows how much demand there is for vibrant urban environments. If you look at the current development in downtown Detroit, I mean, it's at the center of a multi-million population region. Of course, there's people that want to live the urban lifestyle. They want to work in urban settings. And those people that are currently redeveloping downtown understood that really, really well, but also understood that they had to go all in on it. You couldn't do that in a gradual, incremental way, which many people, by the way, had tried over the past decades. They had to go all in, and that's the lifestyle you now have. From vacant to vibrant to overpriced in the matter of a decade, essentially. You're right.
Well, I know you do a lot of work around density and retail and things like that. What about it? What about that in a global trend match what happened in Detroit? Because what I'm learning doing more and more research is that these trends are not like Detroit is not a snowflake. These trends have examples in other cities. And if you follow those examples, there's a lot that you can learn about what's happening now and the future.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of trends that you can really see in downtown Detroit. I mean, let me start off with the trend of authenticity. authenticity, paradoxically, to be honest, has become a product in and of itself. So people are looking for authentic, historic, local environments. And, the gorgeous architecture, the setting in downtown Detroit has really cashed in on that trend. That's one thing that people are looking for. The other thing is, as the Amazons and the Walmarts of this world are really catching most of the retail dollar, what you're seeing is that retail spaces are moving from spaces of transaction, you buy shoes or a hat or a laptop or something like that, to spaces of experience, especially for items that aren't very exciting. Good luck trying to buy a table, a sort of household table or a pan or something like that in downtown Detroit, because the space or the items that you need, you essentially can now buy with next day delivery, right? They're coming into the home the next day. It's the spaces and the things and the experiences that you want. That's what draws people to cities. And that's the type of stuff that you're now seeing in downtown Detroit. So you're seeing the restaurants, the bars, which are essentially experiences that people want to have in their free time. The other thing is, what you are seeing is that retail spaces are changing from spaces of transaction, again, of buying stuff, to spaces for advertisement as well. So in the retail industry, storefronts, especially brand flagship storefronts, are now seen as 3D advertisements, spaces where your brand can be connected to an urban place. And what better urban place than downtown Detroit? So there's that gritty underdog, you can see the Chrysler driving past space. So that's why you see these brands like Nike, Under Armour, that go to downtown. And to be honest, they couldn't care less if you buy a shoe or a shirt. They just want you to know that their brand is somehow spiritually connected to downtown Detroit. So you see this interesting mixture, you see the bars and the restaurants, which do need your dollar on the spot. They want you to have a drink and some food. And then you see these brand flagship stores that just want you to understand that they're in downtown Detroit. So really, downtown Detroit is actually at the forefront of a retail trend. This is what's happening in many, many other cities, but many other cities have this legacy of stores that still sell items instead of experiences. Detroit didn't have that. They can essentially build that up from, well, you can't say from scratch, but they had a lot of space to work with and some pretty progressive developers to take on this new concept of retail.
That leads me to one of the criticisms I often hear of downtown retail is that you can't buy those kind of like residential everyday goods. So what I'm hearing here is that nationally the trend is away from that even being a thing in general, and maybe that's not even something that's in the cards for the future.
That's right. I strongly doubt that you will ever be able to buy a pepper grinder that is not tied to some sort of wonderful story in downtown Detroit. Those days are simply over. Those are the things that are going to come in the next day in an Amazon box. So yes, you're right. Detroit is unlikely to ever have those stores again. By the way, this is the eternal discussion also on food access, which is much more problematic. Where can I buy a loaf of bread or a bag of apples? Even food retail is currently shifting slowly to online. So, every place I work and every place I go, usually the first question is, need more shops? Where can I buy my shoes? Where can I buy my kitchen items? And then where can I buy my food? It's shifting, and it's not shifting to space necessarily. And if it is shifting to space, and this is problematic, especially for a city like Detroit, it's probably shifting into the very high end. Yes, you will buy a bunch of apples, but boy, those are going to be the most special and expensive apples you've ever bought in your life. And the same goes for that pepper grinder. Perhaps there will once be a store that sells you pepper grinders, but they're going to be incredibly expensive because there's going to be some wonderful story attached to that. But your household items, yeah, that's clicking away.
That's really interesting, and it does have a lot of implications. One of the things that I've noticed too is that Detroit has such a intertwined history with the car that, yes, created wealth with certain companies and, factories and the middle class and all that other kind of stuff. But also, I think it irrevocably hurt downtown and the city fabric. One of the things that caught my eye about what you're doing with your book is you talked about 1920s parking lot barons. And I'm sitting here going, okay, so we've been wrestling with this issue for a while. Tell me about this.
So parking lots are an interesting phenomenon. First of all, they're self-reinforcing. This sounds really odd, but the bigger a parking lot becomes, the more efficient it becomes. And the bigger a parking lot becomes, the less attractive anything next to a parking lot becomes in general. Imagine downtown in the 1920s. You have small offices, but you also still have a lot of homes, especially in the peripheries downtown.
I was going to say, people were living right next to the Fox Theater. Like, there were single-family homes on Columbia Street,
Absolutely,
right next to the Fox in the 1920s.
Yeah. So what you get is this very odd phenomenon. You get these small single-family homes, and some of them are really quite nice. And then all of a sudden, someone opens up a parking lot. They tear down a house, and they turn it into a parking lot. And then, you don't want to live there. And what happens is you sell your house, and that also becomes a parking lot, which makes the house next to you even less attractive because now they're living next to a larger parking lot. So these parking lots essentially spread like a blight across the periphery of downtown. What's interesting also is that blight around downtown, you had a full ring of parking. You could not walk comfortably from downtown to any of the neighborhoods by the late 1920s. So that's almost a century ago, because of all these parking lots. But they fed the rest of downtown. They were a crucial element of the skyscrapers of downtown. Effectively, for every skyscraper going up, a block was taken down somewhere else of these smaller homes and turned into parking lots. And as you said, it's fascinating. A lot of this was done completely privately. This was a sort of very bottom-up action. There was no zoning in downtown, so you could take down a house for parking, no problem. And it was quite profitable, especially by the Depression. Offices were becoming incredibly vacant. Homes were starting to fall apart. And the only real big business was parking. So you get this ring of parking just growing and growing around downtown. And frankly, the city got involved, not so much to curb it, to say, we should probably stop doing this. No, to actually encourage it. They said, if only we could have enough parking downtown, maybe that makes sure that our downtown buildings are becoming occupied again. You have to remember, the city of Detroit was very much aligned with automobile interests. So from there on, essentially, all hope was lost, right? You get parking lots spreading across downtown, now taking up half of its space, and then moving into parking garages. And if you look at the reconstruction of downtown today, believe it or not, the calculations I've done for the book, 80% of new construction in downtown Detroit is parking. It's not space for people to stand or to have a drink or to work or to live. No, it's just to park your car, 80%, which of course makes you wonder how much extra money that adds to those actual spaces that you live in. So downtown, ever since the 1920s, has replaced its space for people with space for cars, unfortunately.
That's interesting you talk about that story, because one of the things that was talked about on a previous interview on this show, and we talked with actually the vice president of parking for Bedrock, was the idea of parking just outside of the city center, where you would park and then take the people mover in or take various things into a very walkable center city. In fact, one of the pieces that we did for Detroit Public Television, one of the other voices on there, Stephen Henderson, floated the idea of shutting down Woodward between the Spirit of Detroit and Grand Circus Park and making it all walkable except for buses and the queue line, and having parking kind of outside of that. And that feels like, wow, are we just returning back to something we already did before with this piece of history that I'm not sure everybody knows about?
Yeah, that's right. Because don't forget, they actually did close Woodward Avenue to traffic in the 70s, and that was an absolute disaster. So I don't know if that's a very recommendable thing to do. By no means does it have to be, an urban freeway or anything like that. but you do tend to get the feeling of urban life when you at least can still drive your car through spaces. Retailers love car parking in front of their spaces, even if that parking lot is usually taken up by the store owner. Cars are an element of Detroit. Usually pedestrianizing streets in downtown areas, if the parking isn't perfectly arranged and if there's not a significant percentage of people accessing downtown through public transportation, is a bad idea. So I would actually personally recommend against it. I know that I come from, a country where any urban downtown is pedestrianized, but there you can get on a train or get on a streetcar, and most people don't even come downtown by car. What's also important to recognize is ideas to have parking on the periphery of downtown and to have downtown itself be at least low car or car free. These are ideas that have actually gone back all the way to the 1930s. So there are already ideas to have parking on the edges of downtown and then have people, take, a streetcar or a bus or a people mover and then move into the downtown itself. I still think even without pedestrianizing these downtown streets, I think that's a very good idea because peripheral land is cheaper to begin with. And if you do that, it might actually open up some nice central downtown land for development that's more vibrant to begin with. However, and this is one very big caveat, what about the future of parking to begin with? Because as you now are seeing is the growth of ride-sharing technology. And as people take ride shares, especially to these downtown bars and restaurants, let's hope for heaven's sake they don't drive there to go drink at a bar, you actually see a decreased need for parking. So parking, to be very honest, parking is not a very safe bet at this point. I would actually not build as much parking as people are currently building. Because what if in the nearby future people take more ride share, just still operated by a person, there's less need for parking. But especially what if in 20 years' time that autonomous vehicle becomes reality, then what are we going to do with all those parking garages? Do we still need those? I doubt it, to be very honest. So I wonder if we're fussing about this a lot as technology is actually catching up with us. I think especially a city like Detroit, which has always been very much focused on the future, should really kind of keep these technological advancements in the forefront. So, building more parking on the periphery, making streets car free, I don't know. It's kind of 1950s to me.
That's interesting. When we talk about these kind of parking and developments in the city actually mandates a lot of parking per square foot compared to other places. And a lot of, car dependent things that, a lot of developments eventually they in one way or another get a variance, but that city policy also pushes some of this. And when you speak of parking lots, I can't help but think of our two biggest billionaires. You think about the Ilitch clan and the Gilbert clan and their impact on downtown Detroit. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And since we started with parking, we'll start there and then we'll maybe go to the other folks who maybe don't do as much of giant parking lots.
To answer your first question, parking minimums are out, essentially. Cities mandating parking minimums are stuck in the last century. You're seeing a lot of cities, including my own city of Cincinnati, abolishing parking minimums and instead adopting parking maximum. So they actually say, you know what, if you don't want to build any parking, if you can make a good case for it, then don't build any parking. In fact, we don't want you building more parking because it becomes a cycle, essentially. The more parking you have, the less walkable an environment becomes, the more people will drive, the more parking you need. So to break through that cycle, and I know that this has been a topic of debate in Detroit, you actually have to switch from parking minimums to parking maximums. Now, if you look at the two main developers, of course, this is a big question in downtown Detroit, then you really see a diametrically opposed perspective to the car, but also to car culture. I think Dan Gilbert really understands that the future of downtown is a walkable future. He's aiming for people that just got out of their car and parked it either, yes, at one of his own parking garages, preferably somewhere else, and is trying to draw them into spaces, give them interesting experiences. Whereas, the Illich developments on the periphery are still very, very much car-oriented, rather suburban developments. So they will provide the parking for you. Please drive your car in. We'll provide you with an interesting experience, sports or entertainment, and of course, we'll provide you with the concessions for that experience as well. And then, please drive off. So it's a very car-based vision. So you're seeing two, frankly, quite clashing visions of what a city should be. I think Gilbert's vision is more future-oriented. That's going to be more future-proof by the time that mobility is changing. Especially, and this would be, of course, a bit of a hopeful scenario, just fewer people driving to downtown. Wouldn't it be nice if there's better transit that people can take into downtown? It also would make downtown a little more inclusive for people that can't afford a car.
Which is a huge percentage of, frankly, city residents. I mean, I think I know that we're still in the top 10 of cities with households that don't own a car, which is kind of crazy considering our transit system. I mean, yes, there are very hardworking people trying to make transit better, but compared to like major cities in the world, it's just not a thing.
Absolutely. And that's a great shame. To be honest, this has plagued Detroit for well over a century. I traced various subway proposals, a first sort of pretty tentative proposal in the early 1900s, and then we get more serious proposals for various reasons, absolutely fascinating reasons, by the way, including an endorsement by none other than Henry Ford. These proposals keep getting shot down. So what you have is a city with a streetcar system, but Detroit is absolutely massive. So imagine taking a streetcar from Northwest Detroit to downtown. It was a very insufficient system, which, by the way, people tend to forget. So transit never really worked in downtown or for downtown, which is, by the way, one of the reasons that downtown in size is quite a bit smaller than the size of downtown of comparable cities. Imagine, for instance, comparing downtown Detroit to the Loop in Chicago. The Loop, in terms of office space added, was a multitude of downtown Detroit. So you actually have a relatively small downtown that is very awkwardly confronted with its own offspring, right? The car. Is how do you fit those cars into downtown? But then getting back to today's situation, you have a tremendous proportion of Detroiters that still don't have reasonable access to downtown. And then, of course, the question also becomes, okay, they've just reached downtown. Are they going to buy $120 T-shirts or, $20 craft cocktails? What's in it for them in downtown? That's a big issue right now.
Well, and it definitely is. And that's something that we definitely want to touch on. I know that there's some great neighborhood developers that are doing some stuff, but I know that since your, kind of focus has been downtown, I want to explore, I didn't expect to do this, but I kind of want to explore this mythos of Detroit not having a great transit system back in the day. Because if you look on online forums and places, there's a lot of nostalgia waxed for the streetcars of the past. But what you're telling me is that it really wasn't that great.
No, they really were not that great. The city was very large. Streetcars are, they're great. Don't get me wrong. I grew up using streetcars almost every day. They're very nice. But the kind of distances that you had to travel, even with express streetcars, it was too big. And Detroit really needed a mass transit system, like a subway or raised mass transit system, and never received one. I mean, let me do a comparison. Imagine that you're in Chicago, and instead of the L, you have to take on the streetcars. They have to stop with traffic lights, and every 2 blocks there's a stop. Are you really going to have a great time going all the way out to Evanston or all the way out to Oak Park? It's going to take forever. And to be honest, currently with the L, it already takes quite a long time. So I completely understand nostalgia for streetcars, very interesting transportation technology, but Detroit simply just became too big for the streetcars. And to be honest, by the 1920s, mind you, that's the heyday of downtown. Streetcars were already on their way out. Streetcar ridership into downtown during the 1920s was already dropping. And this is a very controversial discussion, I know, is it's the replacement by buses was initially at least done as sort of an efficiency replacement, saying, well, buses at least are quicker than streetcars. Yeah, we could have this debate for a long, long time, I'm sure. But yes, I am somewhat critical of streetcars. And, if you look at sort of the current wave of streetcars, the Q line in Detroit, we have a similar streetcar in Cincinnati right now. Are they really living up to their expectations at this point? I would say no.
I mean, the Q line, it's very clear to me that the Q line was a development tool, not a transit tool.
Absolutely.
And an excuse to replace the infrastructure underneath Woodward, which needed to happen. But as far as actually transit goes, it kind of acts like when somebody designs something out of a book, but they haven't actually ran the thing before. And so it's like, it looks like a streetcar. It quacks like a streetcar, but like it doesn't have the right of ways. It has weird, like crossing the road in multiple places. Like it doesn't seem like it was designed for serving lots of people, lots of basics that I think any like transportation engineer would look at. They just didn't follow.
That's right. And I think it all comes down to the first thing you mentioned. It was an economic development tool and not a transportation tool. And you're seeing that with a lot of streetcars. Cincinnati has the same issue, essentially. It's an economic development tool, which, by the way, in Cincinnati, it's downtown and over the Rhine, which is a neighborhood north of downtown, doing really well for itself in terms of new development. We can talk about equity and gentrification, of course, but the streetcar is not doing well at all. It doesn't really connect from A to B because it never had that transportation ideal. It was just meant to make sure that the homes along the streetcar would be renovated, which, by the way, I mean, you have to admit, both in Detroit and I can tell you in Cincinnati, that's actually happening quite well. If you look at Midtown Detroit, New Center Detroit, there's all sorts of new stuff coming up. But yeah, it's not exactly a tool to get from A to B in a very efficient way. And again, sometimes I just feel like we're fighting a rear guard battle. Okay, that's a streetcar. How about bike sharing? At the same time Cincinnati started the streetcar, they really invested more in bike sharing. Turns out that, if you're somewhat in good shape, you can actually bike from over the Rhine to downtown a lot quicker than you can take a streetcar.
I was going to say an unsung success story here in Detroit so often is the MoGo. People thought that the MoGo, like our bike sharing system, people would steal the bikes, all that other stuff. Turns out that's not the case. Turns out ridership goes up. Like it's in lots of different areas. Even with me being outside of downtown, they've now expanded into neighborhoods. They're even doing it as a regional program now in walkable suburbs. So in theory, you could even MoGo from the suburbs if you wanted to hop stations. Like it's kind of crazy, but it's something that they've really made a lot of progress and against popular tide where they're like, oh, that'll never work. And they're making it happen.
I've always found, and maybe that's just my Dutch heritage, I found Detroit a great biking city. It's nice and flat. You probably don't want to bike there in February, but, in the summer, it's a lovely city. The streets are wide enough for bike lanes. So what you're finding is this almost bottom-up movement of these bike shares, somewhat more controversial, these little scooters that are scattered all over the sidewalks. Turns out they can actually take on the task of going from A to B just as well as those multi-million-dollar streetcars. But they're different, right? Streetcars are an economic development tool. They show to developers that the city is invested. They've invested a lot in this transportation system. They won't let this neighborhood down. That's a much different thing to do than to build a bunch of bike share stations or to plop down some scooters, right? So it's different tools for different things.
You mentioned the word investment. So let's talk about, I think to kind of bring this conversation home, I want to talk about the future and investment in downtown Detroit, because we've got a few major players. We've got Gilbert, we've got Illich, we've got some other people who have bellied up in the very recent years. But is this really a market? Is this really a thing? Or is this driven by some very passionate people? What do you kind of see in the reality crystal ball? And I ask you because you're outside of it. There's so many people here that are in it, invested in it. They want it to happen a certain way. You're not. You're comparing it to a variety of world cities and your academic experience. What do you see?
As an academic, I always will have to say pros and cons. So in a certain way, especially Dan Gilbert's model of redeveloping downtown really aligns with the global consensus of what a downtown should be in terms of creativity, bringing people together, high quality public space. experiential bars, restaurants, retail. It really ticks all the right boxes. From an equity perspective, there's major work to be done. Why is Detroit not represented in downtown? Is there an opportunity for entrepreneurship beyond brand flagships and high-end bars? For instance, entrepreneurship that reflects the rest of Detroit. Ilitch is a different question altogether. The model of Gilbert and Ilitch, I always say, are diametrically opposed. And the analogy I always use is if you open up a building next to a Dan Gilbert development, that's a good thing. There's more people on the sidewalk, more crowd, more buzz, more Instagram pictures. If you open up a development next to an Ilitch development, that's considered a bad thing because you're leaking customers away from the concessions, from the theater, from the stadium, et cetera, et cetera. That's a model that's more difficult to defend in the long term, and it certainly isn't a very urban model. The big question mark, of course, becomes how does this fare with a coming economic recession? Will people still buy $120 shirts if they don't have a job, or if they, craft cocktails if they don't have a job? So room for innovation in downtown is difficult. Don't forget, downtown also needs older spaces, somewhat rundown spaces, because that's where the new ideas grow. Our sort of messiah in the planning world is Jane Jacobs, and her mantra was always, new ideas need old buildings. How many of those are there in downtown? Downtown was the home of the quadricycle of Henry Ford because it was in a crummy little shed behind his house. How many crummy sheds are left in downtown? So that's something that is worth questioning as well, is where is this new creative crowd coming? Are they in downtown, or have they been pushed out of downtown to surrounding neighborhoods? And where does Brooklyn now move to Detroit? There's pros and cons. I can certainly see a grand future for certain spaces in downtown, but new creativity, more affordable spaces, and frankly, more equity and representation of the rest of that massive city of Detroit are really badly needed in downtown.
This conversation made me think. And I think it's because I've traveled around, I've seen other downtowns, that in downtown Detroit, that we really have no idea what a real boom looks like. Economically especially, downtown Detroit is just woefully behind. The things that we talk about in the press as massive change are, frankly, everyday occurrences in much of the nation. I thought about a recent visit to Charlotte, North Carolina, and it made my head spin with the number of cranes I saw out the windows of the places I visited. Think about the economic opportunity from bottom to top. The city of Detroit, like Charlotte, started adding 15,000 people a year, every year, for 2 decades. Instead, we're debating census numbers, whether or not we're going to see a tiny rise, and frankly, all it's going to matter is public relations points. Or what if we looked at Atlanta, a city that's been seeing growth since 2010? Think about the restaurant, the healthcare, the construction jobs, the tax revenue, as the city here has an income tax that could be plowed back into the city's parks and worker training programs, and hopefully some into the schools. Detroit at one point had more than double the people we have now. We have the space. Why don't we use something like Atlanta or Charlotte as a metric to shoot for, instead of clawing onto this idea of not losing, or having just a little game? Anyway, enough of my rambling. I know it was a bit longer conversation, but I figured with the weekend we could do something with it, and the guest, at least to me, was interesting and very generous with his time. Conrad's book, again, is Dream City, Creation, Destruction, and Reinvention in Downtown Detroit. We will have a link in the show notes. Thanks to the folks behind the scenes that make contributions, great and small: Cheyenne Nocerini, Randy Walker, Fletcher Sharp, and of course, I could never forget Sven Gustafson. And of course, you, our members, at patreon.com/dailydetroit. Have a wonderful weekend. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and I'll see you around Detroit.